Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The House of Representatives today will debate and vote on a measure to urge Vice President Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to strip power from President Donald Trump for the remainder of his presidency. If Pence doesn't comply, and it's believed he won't, then the House tomorrow will debate and vote on impeaching Donald Trump for a second time. And with 218 co-sponsors to the impeachment article, which is just over half of the House, it's most likely to succeed, thus forcing the Senate to hold a trial. We'll get into that timeline in just a moment. Joining me on Skype is one of the leading experts in this country on impeachment. It's Frank O. Bowman. He is the Dean's Visiting Scholar at Georgetown Law School, and he also teaches law at the University of Missouri. He is the author of the book, High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. Frank Bowman, it is my very good pleasure, sir, to welcome you back to this radio program.
It's great to see and hear you again, Mitch.
You know, a year ago, during the first impeachment, I got to spend an afternoon with you, and it was an important afternoon for me because I learned a ton about impeachment, the history of impeachment, the ideas behind impeachment. I mean, we went through the whole, I think we talked for several hours, and it was very beneficial for me. And I remember that we were both theorizing at one point that maybe we're moving into an age in which we see impeachment happen more frequently. And what I mean by that, our first impeachment that we get of a president anyways is 1868, almost 100 years after, a little under 100 years after the ratification of the Constitution. Then we don't have really another impeachment proceedings anyways until the mid-1970s with Richard Nixon. And then 25 years later, you get the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And then, 16, 17 years after that, we get the impeachment of Donald Trump. But as we were talking about this, Professor Bowman, I never imagined that I would be talking to you about another impeachment just a year later.
Nor did I, Mitch, nor did I.
Do you think this is what we're moving towards? Do you think impeachment is something that's going to be more common now that we see it a year later?
I don't know. I mean, I'm such a bad prognosticator. I don't know. I think the fact that we've had, certainly these two successive impeachments is not so much a testament to any particular increased prevalence of impeachments as it is to the unique awfulness of Donald Trump. Susan Collins famously said a year ago, well, he's been impeached once, he's learned his lesson, Well, obviously not. He's a uniquely bad president. But moreover, and this, of course, is the reason for this second impeachment, he is not a singularity. He is not in his person the only problem. The problem is that he has come to represent the interests and hopes of many millions of Americans. He has either given voice to things that they perhaps were thinking all along, or I think certainly with respect to the election, he has contributed to diluting them. And that has, I think, required a response, a constitutional response in the form of a second impeachment. We can talk about the timing and the practical consequences of that. But the answer to your question, I think, is simply the rapidity of these two impeachments is a testament both to Trump and to the particularly divided state of our current politics. Now, might that persist? And certainly that's the fear all of us have, I think, that we will prove unable somehow or other to get past this, to at least move towards a more constructive politics in the future. And if indeed we are in an era where we simply switch back and forth between one of two horribly divided parties in control of the government, each seeking to strike out at the other, then maybe impeachment would be a symptom of that problem. But I certainly hope not.
Yeah. Today, the House, before they get to impeachment tomorrow, today the House is trying to encourage the president to invoke the 25th Amendment that would wrestle power away from the president and vest it into the vice president. Any difference to you between the 25th Amendment and impeachment at this point, or does it not really matter? What do you think between these two options?
Well, I think it certainly matters. First of all, of course, we know that the 25th Amendment thing, unless some miracle occurs, it's not going to work. I mean, I think this is an effort to place the onus of saying something about the fundamental qualifications of Mr. Trump back on the people who have been around him and to some extent enabled him for the last, well, to a large extent enabled him for the last 4 years. But it's largely performative. We know that, or I say we know, we certainly think that Vice President Pence is unlikely to respond, either because he doesn't want to do it himself or because he's privately polled the members of the cabinet and recognizes that he could not secure a majority. For listeners who are sort of unfamiliar with the mechanics of the 25th Amendment, the principal way that it can be invoked is the vice president essentially gathers the cabinet, and a majority vote of the cabinet is necessary to convey to the House and the Senate a declaration that, in fact, the president is incapable of performing the duties of the office. So it might be that he simply can't summon the votes, even if he wanted to. But regardless, and we don't know what it is, but maybe we'll find out someday, I think the odds are it ain't going to happen. The other, and certainly the House can at least impeach the president right now, as excuse me, as was indicated, there are already 218 co-sponsors of the impeachment resolution, and it's going to pass. So the House is going to impeach him. That much at least can be done, and that's a certainty. Of course, the other difference about the 25th Amendment is that if it could be successful, it could remove Trump from office and power and access to the levers of government and perhaps the levers of the military over this remaining week or so, and that would be a good thing. Whereas impeachment, practically speaking, will not. There's no way you're going to get a trial in the Senate, even if you ultimately could get a conviction, until after President-elect Biden is inaugurated.
So we are anticipating if the House does impeach Donald Trump tomorrow, which is expected, that the Senate wouldn't hold the trial until after President Trump's term ends. Now, when we talk about precedents, and let's talk about some precedents concerning impeachment, it's not just presidents who are impeached. Cabinet members can be impeached as well. Are there precedents for impeaching somebody after they're no longer in that position that you're trying to impeach them from?
Yes, there are several. The critical ones are Senator William Blunt, who was impeached in 1797. Senator Blunt was an interesting character. He was from Tennessee, which was then on the frontier, and he was kind of a Western land speculator, and he got it into his head to try to help the British secure control over what was then Spanish Florida, as well as large sections of the Louisiana Purchase. And when this scheme was found out and reported back to Congress, he was immediately impeached, and shortly thereafter, the Senate voted to expel him. The trial was conducted after the expulsion, of course, when he was no longer a senator, and ultimately he was acquitted. There's some debate about why, because he certainly was guilty. The two possible reasons were the argument that the Senate lacked jurisdiction because he wasn't any longer in office, but the one that most historians, I think, conclude was the real reason was they concluded that senators can't be impeached, that they are not civil officers subject to impeachment under the Constitution. But nonetheless, we had an impeachment, we had a trial, and it certainly seems likely that if they hadn't decided on the issue of his being a senator, they would have convicted him.
Yeah, that's why we don't have impeachment
Later on, go ahead.
I was going to say that's why we don't have
Later on,
impeachment of lawmakers anymore. Now it's a different process of being expelled.
right. And then the other issue, the other precedent is the Secretary of War, William Belknap, who was impeached in the 1870s. He was Secretary of War under Grant, and he had interesting story. He married a very extravagant wife who wanted all the good things, and therefore an otherwise pretty good fellow began to look around for sources of revenue, and he decided to sell an office that was under his control, that of being an Indian agent somewhere out in the Oklahoma Territory or somewhere, for a bunch of money. This was found out, and when it became clear that he'd done this, he was reported that he was about to be impeached. He went over to talk to President Grant, who immediately secured his resignation, but the House went ahead and impeached him anyway. And thereafter, there was a trial in the Senate, and there was actually a debate about whether or not they retained jurisdiction over Secretary Belknap, given that he was impeached after he left office. The Senate took a vote whereby a significant majority, they decided they did have jurisdiction, albeit it wasn't a majority. It was a procedural vote, but there wasn't a two-thirds majority for that proposition. In the end, they acquitted him. It's not really clear why. There was still a majority to convict him, but they did acquit him because they didn't get the two-thirds. Not clear quite why it did that. Certainly some senators were concerned about the jurisdictional issue. I think the others of them had concerns that this was just a political attack on Grant, which in part was. And others of them were basically thinking, it's a moot point. We'll leave this guy to the criminal processes, and we're not going to mess with it. And there have been judges who have been impeached and then resigned, and the Senate has decided not to follow through. But in each of these cases, there have been expressions by people involved in this, the House or senators, saying, well, we're letting this guy go, but we're not conceding that we don't have jurisdiction. It's just that we don't think it's worth our effort for this judge, because the main point was to get him off the bench. So long and the short of it is, there is certainly precedent for impeaching people before they leave office and trying them afterwards. There's a precedent for impeaching them after they leave office and trying them afterwards. But certainly it's going to be an argument that's going to be raised.
I think most political observers believe that there won't be 17 Republicans in a trial that will come and vote to convict the president after a trial. Now, we haven't had the trial yet, so you have the trial, and which might be really the only opportunity we'll have of a good investigation and airing of what happened at the Capitol last week, considering how quickly they're moving in the House to impeach the president. Is there a reason? Is impeaching now the House is who impeaches? If the House votes to impeach, the president's been impeached. Doesn't mean they're removed from office. They have to be convicted by the Senate first. But is there reason? Is there significance of just the impeachment in of itself, even if it isn't successful in removing a person from a position and convicting that person?
I'd certainly argue that there is. Now, before explaining why I think that's so, I think there's also a fair argument to be made, and I was nearly convinced by this argument a few days ago, as I thought about this myself. There's a fair argument to be made that, well, since we can't remove him from office, and we're gonna end up having a trial dragging the administration of Joe Biden, that maybe this is just an unnecessary distraction, and that the country has got other fish to fry. The Biden administration has got an administration to put in place in terms of cabinet secretaries, that there's stimulus to be thought about, that it's a whole response to the COVID crisis, and that Congress should be doing other things. It's a fair argument, and I certainly wouldn't you know, violently disagree with anybody who thinks that it's a darn good reason just not to do this. On the other hand, I do think that what's happened, not just on the 6th, but over the preceding couple of months, is a matter of such incredible consequence for this country that some sort of constitutional response is appropriate. And the only available constitutional response for Congress, which is, after all, the institution that was assaulted here. And I don't mean just assaulted in physically, although they certainly were, and people died in consequence. But what Donald Trump is really being impeached for is the fact that over a period of 2 months following the election, he and his aiders and abettors and enablers promoted an utterly false narrative about the election. He suggested over and over and over again that the election had been stolen from him. He still claims that. He convinced a bunch of people that that's true, or at least that they should say it's true. He tried actually to get officials in the states to overturn the verdict of their voters, like happened down in Georgia. He tried to convince Vice President Pence to do something which he plainly constitutionally cannot do, which is essentially declare Donald Trump the winner, even though he wasn't. He tried to convince Congress as a body to refuse to certify the election when there was absolutely no reason to do that, and frankly, to do that would have been unconstitutional. He tried in some to make himself literally an unelected autocrat. And all that culminated in an effort which didn't just happen on the 6th, but which began earlier, of inviting to the capital of the United States, inviting to Washington, D.C., thousands and thousands of Trump supporters for the precise purpose of placing pressure on Congress to do something that it plainly constitutionally had no power to do, for the precise purpose of inducing Congress by whatever means to refuse to do its constitutional duty. Now, in the end, Donald Trump sent that mob down Pennsylvania Avenue, and whether he intended merely to place pressure on Congress by virtue of having this mob surrounding the Capitol, or whether he thought, or perhaps should have realized, that they might actually try to invade the place, to some extent doesn't really matter. This was a concerted scheme over 2 months to overturn a fairly conducted election in the United States. It was a direct, premeditated, long drawn-out attack on the central institution of the American idea, which is free and fair elections. That is something that has never ever happened in this country, and we came. I think it's not hyperbole to say that we came very close to losing American democracy in the last week. Or at least casting the country into violent turmoil from which it might not have recovered for God knows how long. That's a matter of such consequence that I think the Congress needs to take it up. Even if, in the end, Republicans refuse to recognize the severity. Even if, in the end, Republicans remain so much in thrall either to Trump the man or to his supporters that they refuse to do their duty, I think we need an airing of this. We can't sweep it under the rug. We cannot, I think, even allow Republican elected officials the luxury of not addressing this. Now, if they want to stand up on the floor of the Senate and explain why they refused to convict this man who not only endangered democracy, but essentially incited a mob that could have killed them personally, then let them. But I think this is a matter that needs to be taken care of. And I also think that Congress, when it wants to, can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think they can run an impeachment proceeding and do other things at the same time. It's not an ideal situation, but I think it's necessary.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Frank Bowman. He's the Dean's Visiting Scholar at Georgetown Law School, and he teaches law at the University of Missouri. He is the author of the book, High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. Well, Donald Trump was in a category with two other presidents, Bill Clinton and Andrew Johnson, as being the only three presidents to have been impeached while in office. Now he could potentially be in a category all of his own, at least for presidents, of being impeached twice. Beyond presidents, has anyone ever been impeached twice before?
No, it's never been necessary. And the reason why, of course, is that if you consider the category of officials who are subject to impeachment, there's cabinet officers, and they're almost never impeached, basically for the reason that was illustrated by Secretary Belknap's case. Once it becomes clear that a cabinet officer is teetering on the brink of impeachment, he just gets fired, or she just gets fired, or resigns. And only in Belknap's case did Congress ever think it necessary or desirable to go on and fool with it. So that's not going to happen. Judges, the purpose of impeaching them always is to get them out of office, and so once they are impeached, they are automatically expelled from office, and therefore there's never any real reason to subsequently impeach them. Now, the disqualification remedy is not automatic. That has to be the subject of a second vote. Parenthetically, Senate tradition and practice suggests that you only need 51 votes to disqualify somebody, although you need 67 votes first to convict them. And occasionally, in fact, just in one case that I know of, a judge has managed to return to public life. Florida judge was impeached. In the 90s, he was expelled. But then several years later, ran for Congress and was elected.
Is that because is that because they never took that second vote?
They didn't take the second vote.
Yeah.
So this is an illustration of the possibility that there can be a return to public life even after impeachment. Elsie Hastings was the federal judge who, sadly now I think is quite ill with cancer. But now Congressman Hastings made a second act in American life, even though he was impeached and thrown out off the bench. And I suppose for those who think that Donald Trump represents a continuing threat to American democracy, that's a cautionary tale. Sometimes you think you've gotten rid of somebody and they keep coming back.
Let's talk about the constitutionality of impeachment and the charges that the House of Representatives is bringing against the president. They reference in the article high crimes and misdemeanors. Can you talk to me about what that means and how it's applicable in this case? Sure.
High crimes and misdemeanors is one of the constitutionally specified grounds for impeachment. The phrase in the Constitution is treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And as we all learned a year ago, it's a very expansive term. It does not require proof of an actual indictable crime. It can reach any of a wide range of behaviors by a president that in the end are, the easiest way to put it may be, sort of subversive of the constitutional order in one way or another. The particular article that will probably pass out of the House tomorrow alleges incitement of insurrection, which certainly, and it alleges a great many other things, but that's some of the operative language. That certainly, if proven, is a high crime and misdemeanor. I don't think there's any reasonable doubt of that issue. I've frankly been a little concerned about the House's choice to include a couple words and phrases that they have. For example, incitement suggests that there's some necessity to prove that Mr. Trump sought consciously to cause violence. And I think his defenders could plausibly claim, well, all he thought he was doing was sending them down there to have a peaceful demonstration. It also requires them to at least talk about what insurrection means. They've referred, for example, to the to the third part of the 14th Amendment, which talks about this issue, about insurrection. Again, golly, I'd kind of prefer that they not frame it in that way, because it allows a whole bunch of arguments about, well, is this really insurrection, or is it just a spontaneous, action by a bunch of crazy people? But I think if you look at the rest of the article, in toto, what it's really alleging is just what I talked about before, which is, in toto, it plainly stretches the timeline out for months and talks about Trump's conduct over a long period of time, culminating in the actions on January the 6th. And I think fairly read is alleging that he essentially tried to overturn the election, and that he took actions that certainly foreseeably could result not only in sort of trying to place totally illegitimate moral pressure on Congress to fail to do its duty, but certainly could foreseeably result in people taking violent action in order to pursue that end. I think it plainly states a constitutional offense. Again, they probably put some landmines in there for themselves in terms of the House managers addressing the Senate, but I don't think they're fatal. And in any case, they've plainly got a strong case.
I don't want to spend too much time on this because I have one last question for you, but what I'm hearing is that perhaps the way this article has been worded, it gives the defenders of the president a way out, or the president a way out, by saying, well, he never said go to the Capitol and attack it, or he actually never called directly for an insurrection.
Yeah, that's going to be the argument.
Yeah.
There's even going to be the rather preposterous argument that somehow the First Amendment protects him, which is, which a lot of very serious people are going to say, well, the First Amendment Act. No, it's nonsense. The First Amendment does not protect, presidents when they, over a course of time, facilitate a false narrative about an election for the purpose of overturning it, and then stands up in front of a crowd of people and says a bunch of stuff which any reasonable person in the crowd would take as being an invitation to go down the Capitol and place a lot of pressure on Congress to do something that it had no constitutional power to do.
And finally, and again, I was referencing earlier, got a great opportunity a little over a year ago to spend an afternoon with you, and we talked about the whole history of impeachment. It was fascinating. It was, kind of foundational to everything I learned about this very issue and the previous impeachment. That all said, I have, in reflecting on the impeachment from a year ago, have thought that, I think it was the appropriate thing to do to impeach the president, but at the time, politically, a failure. I don't know, in light of what's happening now today and what's happened in this last week, how I still see that, but I'm curious as to how you reflect upon the impeachment from a year ago.
I thought then, and I think now, that it was something that Congress needed to do. I don't think there's any question that Mr. Trump was guilty of high crime and misdemeanor in his conduct with respect to the Ukraine. And, one of the principal points of the impeachment clauses, the impeachment remedy, is to remove from office a president who is demonstrably dangerous to the constitutional order. It was plain to everyone with eyes to see that this was a man who was dangerous to the constitutional order. Republicans, for their own political interests, refused to acknowledge that. And everything that's happened since is the result of their cowardice, putting it plainly. They could have prevented what's happened. People would be alive today. A great many people would be alive today, frankly, considering the COVID mess. But a great many people would be alive today, and certainly the people who died on the 6th of January would be alive today if Republicans had taken up their constitutional responsibility and judged the matter on the facts. I think sometimes, even though impeachment is inherently a political process and has to be administered and understood in that way, and therefore should be only used when, by and large, the political benefits outweigh political benefits in the large sense, not some party or the other, but political benefits in the large sense to the country. It should generally only be used when there's a fair calculation that the constitutional interests of the country require it. Trump was a danger to the American Constitution a year ago. He's a danger now. An effort was made to try to forestall what's happened over the last year. It failed, but I think it had to be tried. And I feel the same now. The fact that it may not work is more of a testament to the regrettable and divided state of our politics than it is, to the constitutional framework.
Frank Bowman is the Dean's Visiting Scholar, Georgetown Law School. He also teaches law at the University of Missouri. He is the author of the book, High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. He has joined us to talk about this second impeachment effort against the president. Professor Bowman, I know you are in very high demand, so we are extremely thankful to you for taking this time to talk to us today. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure anytime, Mitch.